Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, a podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journey and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist, and today I'm joined by a fellow religious trauma specialist, Michelle Moseley. Michelle, I didn't even double check. I'm a terrible podcast host. Did I get your last name correct?
You did.
Oh, man. Winging it here.
You did great. So,
Michelle, thanks for joining me today.
you're welcome. I'm so excited to be here with you and to have this opportunity to chat.
Yeah. I love getting different people from around the country because I love other accents. And I feel like Midwesterners have the worst accent. And you're just so nice. Like that Southern East Coast accent is so pleasant to listen to.
Yeah, I am lifelong North Carolinian and I definitely have the accent.
Well, it's awesome. I always start with the same question, which is what got you into the mental health field?
So when I graduated from college, I thought about going into the counseling field. And then I just felt what at the time I would have said was a call to ministry, specifically working with college students. So I took a detour and did that for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And some stuff went down in that environment, which we might get into in the rest of our discussion. But at almost the 10-year mark, it was just kind of like, this is not working. This is not a good environment for me. But I still wanted to continue helping people and being able to support people. And I wanted to get more skills in how can I do that outside of a religious context. So
Sure.
that idea of going back to graduate school, pursuing a counseling degree came back up. And so in my mid-30s, I went back to graduate school, and I have been in the field for about 9 years now. So that was kind of my winding path.
Yeah, we all kind of have a different winding path to get here. There's so much in that makes me curious. I spent some time in higher ed at a Christian institution when I was still a good little Christian. So I think there's a lot to talk about there. But this idea, it sounds like helping people was there consistently, just working on figuring out what role or what structure that was going to take.
Yeah, I think that has been a big thing for me throughout, of like having some kind of way to support people, to help them, to do some type of like teaching or something in that kind of role, has always been there, but there's been like different paths that it has taken.
Yeah. So I introduced you as a religious trauma specialist, knowing that's some overlap between the two of us. What was kind of that journey? That's, I would say, a growing field. There are still a limited number of professionals who advertise and specialize in this area. So how'd you kind of end up in that specific corner of the mental health world?
So I had my own experience of spiritual abuse and religious trauma. I did not have the words for it at the time that it was happening. And I was seeing a therapist. She didn't specialize in religious trauma or anything like that, but she just recognized that a lot of the symptoms that I was talking about resonated as trauma symptoms. And it was really freeing when she mentioned that, like, Michelle, it really sounds like you're having some trauma responses.
Yeah.
And it really validated my own experience. Then fast forward a couple of years, went to grad school. I had no intentions of working with religious trauma because my own experience was still so fresh. It was like, I want to stay away from that. Got out of grad school. A couple of years in, I had a client that actually came to me for something else, but it came up that part of their story was around some religious things, some traumatic stuff that had happened. And they just really felt comfortable because I understood the language. I resonated with what they were saying. They didn't have to explain, just the in language of their experience. And they ended up referring some other people to me because they were like, hey, she gets it. Like, And it just kind of happened that I was like, okay, I'm far enough in my journey that this is not affecting me in the same way that it would have, 2, 3, 4 years previously. And I'm able to support these folks and help them find a healthier place for themselves. And so I always kind of joke, it's like the niche that found me.
Sure. Yeah. And isn't that fascinating how clients in our own journeys, I think a lot of people approach therapy as like the therapist is set and then the clients come to them, but like we're always changing and updating and learning and growing too. And something like spiritual harm or deconstruction or these processes that therapists go through, just like everyone else, shifts and changes kind of how we approach the clients that we're working with.
Yeah, exactly.
25-year-old Jeremy started out at a Christian counseling place. And so, yeah, like if you would have told me a decade ago that I'd be where I'm at now doing religious trauma therapy for people and this stuff, like I've been like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yep. Same here. I would have been like, nope, not working with that.
Yeah. So yeah, the specialties find us sometimes. So making sense of kind of your timeline here, you had kind of your own process, your experience of religious harm, and then your own therapy, and that was before going back to grad school, or were those things kind of overlapped?
That was before.
Okay.
So I left full-time ministry in 2013. And I that was in like May of 2013. And then I started grad school in August of 2014. So I had about a year there that was not an overlap, that it was like working on my own process and even just coming to terms with the experiences that I had had.
Yeah. And it is, there's a convenience, certainly, I think, in working with religious trauma, knowing, I mean, like you said, your clients found you because you knew the language. And it is very culty, is the word I use. Like I grew up fundamentalist evangelical. Like there's a language that goes to it. I can talk Southern Baptist and I can talk, East Coast Baptist, but like there's a specific Midwestern evangelical language that people know if they grew up in it, and it sounds really weird if you didn't.
Yeah, yes, it does. And I think for a lot of folks, if you work with a therapist that doesn't have any context of the language, like you can spend a lot of time having to explain things. And rather than feeling like you're getting support, feeling like you're providing an education. And also the therapist may not really understand the impact of what you experienced, because the whole concepts can be so foreign. Like it is a whole another language.
Yeah. And there's so much in those languages, like saying purity culture is a small 2-word term, but there's so much that goes into that if you were raised in a high control religion, purity culture affects you on a deep level.
Yes.
Versus just the psychological or the intellectual concept of this is the definition of purity culture.
Yes. And one of the things that I am kind of venturing into, have been over the past year, is providing some education for other therapists around those things, both for therapists, just because in North Carolina, like we're in the Bible Belt, even if you have no desire to work with religious trauma, you're going to come across folks that have experienced some harm or even just some like off moments in religion. It's helpful to recognize that. And so that's one of the things that I have been working on. I recently got approved for as an MBCC provider to offer some training around that, just to help therapists in that area. And so there is more support for folks.
Right. Yeah. And for the few of my listeners who aren't therapists, there are some, most of them are therapists, but that therapists need continuing education. So depending on the state, Wisconsin, for example, where I'm at, 36 continuing ed credits every 2 years. And so what Michelle's talking about is those continuing ed credits. You have to get them from certified locations, and there's a whole process that goes into that to get certified and all that. So kudos to you for going through that whole process. But then this is training that other therapists can get and count it towards their continuing ed, which I don't know what it is in North Carolina, but I'm imagining probably in that 30, 36
Yeah, it's 40.
hour. Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
at least for my licensure, it's 40. I know there's different.
Yeah, and I'm an LMFT, so there's some variance.
Yeah.
In that too.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I forget that not everybody would be aware of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but it is that I think that speaks to what I was saying a little bit earlier. Like, this is the growing fields. Like, when I went and got my certification in religious trauma, it was two, I will say, specifically 2 locations where I could go and get some actual formal training in it. And I think as we're seeing the rise of the nuns, as we get these headlines everywhere, the non-religious or no religious affiliation demographic rises in the United States, there's going to be a need for therapists who know how to work with this, because people are leaving the church in record numbers.
Yep. That is so
what
true.
is it? What is it like in your community? Like, your website, it's very upfront. Religious trauma is one of the things you work with. What has the support been from either local therapists or just the local community around being someone who says, hey, not only is church not always awesome, but sometimes it's harmful?
It can be very varied. I have some folks, both professionally, even a few like church leaders in the area that are very supportive, that understand, like, even though I might be a pastor or a leader in a church, I recognize that these environments can be harmful, and they appreciate having a connection with somebody that, they even refer folks or that kind of thing. And then there's, other folks that are very committed to their faith, and they feel that my work is a kind of like an enemy or like an antagonist to their faith. And I don't get very many direct, like, harassing or mean comments, but a lot of people will just gloss over it, move past it, not really even ask, like, what does that mean? Like, what kind of work is that? I've had some really fruitful conversations with some folks that were willing to be curious and like, okay, so I am very religious. What does that mean that you work with religious trauma? And they're open to the conversation. So it's a very varied mix.
Yeah. My background is marriage and family therapy. And so that's my licensure, and that's one of my specialties. And I have years of people, when I tell them that's what I do for work, sharing their marital woes immediately, which is always awkward. Not always awkward. It's sometimes awkward depending on our setting. And now that I specialize in religious trauma, if that's what I lead with, I will get a lot of, like, I was beaten with a ruler in my Catholic day school, and like, yo, we're in a grocery store. Like, I'm happy to have this conversation, but like, so I think there is a weird, the spectrum's really wide between people who are aware and willing and ready to talk about it, and people who still think church is always a plus. And it's an interesting kind of, there's a lot of interesting space between those two spectrums.
And I think there's a lot of folks for whom it's hard to balance or acknowledge that both can be true, that like religion or church can be a positive environment for folks, and it can be harmful for folks. And sometimes it's the same person that's having both of those experiences.
Yeah. And with working with a lot of clients, like in the deconstruction process or the reconstruction, kind of rebuilding where spirituality is going to look like, it's a struggle, because if you're raised fundamentalist, you want to do the black and white thinking. So you want to go, oh, I thought church was good, but I've learned it's bad, so now all church is bad. And like, that works for some people, but for some people that's a pattern we still kind of have to untangle of that black and white thinking.
Yeah. And I think the way you described that speaks to how it is an individual thing. Like, at least in my work, like, my role that I view is to support a person in figuring out what their journey is. And so I am not somebody that's like going to push you toward any kind of spiritual or church involvement or away from it. Like, I'm
Yeah.
here to support you as you navigate and figure out what your own path is.
Yeah, and it is so variable. We're talking specifically about church harm, but I think therapy specifically also has some space in which spiritual providers, practitioners who come from a strong religious background can do harm in the therapy space, which is why I think having some training and continuing ed type things is really lovely, because also people who have been harmed in the church go to therapy and are harmed there as well, because the therapist assumes or doesn't ask enough questions, or just leads with prayer, or has a Bible out on the coffee table, or whatever it might look like. And I think, again, for a lot of people who don't have the language, who maybe don't know what deconstruction is, or who don't know the signs and symptoms of trauma, that might be triggering, but they might not know why.
Yeah, yeah. And they might not have the words to put to, like, what is this experience? Or especially in a lot of fundamentalist kind of high control environments, you've basically been trained to trust the quote unquote leader. And when you come into somebody's therapy office, like, that therapist can be viewed as a leader.
Right.
And so this makes me feel a little off, but I'm supposed to trust you, so I guess it's okay.
Yeah.
Rather than trusting your intuition of, like, yeah, something's off about this.
Yeah. Well, and that medical model that a lot of therapists are drawing from too is very authoritarian in principle. So the therapist is the expert. And so even if you're not practicing from that idea, if you're not actively working against that idea, clients are going to pick up on it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is something that you have to be aware of as a therapist working with religious trauma, is that we do have that medical model, especially if you're working with insurance, that is in the back of your mind, and it really can play into this authoritarian type of dynamic in the relationship. And with folks who've experienced religious trauma, they're already coming in kind of naturally looking for a leader, for someone to guide them or tell them what to do, because that's been a lot of their experience. And so really fighting back against that, really, like, talking about consent and talking about autonomy and being very conscious of, okay, here are opportunities. I'm not the expert on you.
Right.
You are the expert on you.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to travel backwards in time a little bit with you, if that's okay, to kind of working in a ministry setting. That was in higher ed, correct?
Yeah, well, it's an international ministry, but I worked in the part that works with college students. So I was in working with higher ed with college students all the time.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, you can share your experience. It's I think there's some overlap between the education system, patriarchy, capitalism, that whole system where, yes, there's religious trauma, and there's all these stacks of hierarchical systems that kind of can, if it's a toxic or an unhealthy work environment, it can be really hard to come out from underneath that, because there's all this societal pressure from religion, from capitalism, from the way that we do employment in this country. There's a lot of things working against acknowledging that it's an unhealthy or toxic environment and then getting out.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of that I didn't realize as it was happening. The patriarchy piece was a big part of my experience of spiritual abuse. And I, toward the end, could put a name to that. But the way that capitalism influenced how long I stayed in a situation that I knew was not healthy, I couldn't have put a name to that at the time. But it is, if your job is in ministry and that is where your full income comes from, and at the time I was a single adult, like, the idea of, I don't know if I believe this anymore, this is a harmful environment, I need to leave, that is terrifying.
Yeah.
Because then how do I pay for shelter? How do I pay for food? So yeah, the way that all those systems play together definitely I feel like I become more and more aware every
Yeah.
day.
Well, and if you need to get a lawyer, Christians aren't supposed to sue each other. And like
Mm-hmm.
there's all these things where the patriarchy is built into, I'm going to oversimplify a touch here, but say like the patriarchy is built into Abrahamic religions. And so Christianity being one of those, like you're taught, especially if you're raised in it from an early age, that like, right, Christians don't go to court against each other, and that like accountability comes from God, not.
Mm-hmm.
So even something like going to HR or like filing a complaint can trigger a lot of fear and anxiety, even if you're not at that point where you're ready to leave.
Yeah, yeah. And because those systems are so built in to the religion part, yes, this is an organization and they have an HR department, but there's a lot of things that are toxic and harmful, but are not viewed that way by HR because they're
Right.
viewed as being in the Bible, male leadership, that kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and married to a teacher who worked at religious schools, also before deconstructing, like this idea that your ministry is worthwhile, and so it's okay to underpay you or to not provide you with all the support that you might need because that's your calling.
yes, and your reward is in heaven.
Right.
So it's okay if you are suffering now. In fact, you should be suffering now.
Right. That's good. Gold star for you for bearing that cross.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've been out of it for years, and it's still, when you look at it all, it kind of as a big picture, it's still so yucky.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like in my experience, I did grow up in the Southern Baptist Church,
Mm-hmm.
but I grew up in a small town, and I think my church experience was not the same as folks that grew up in a really like structured Southern Baptist church. Like
Mm-hmm.
in my church, there were women that took leadership roles because if they didn't, there were no other people.
Sure.
You know, and so I really was more indoctrinated into a lot of the systems during my time in ministry.
Sure.
And my brain naturally looks for that black and white, here are the rules, follow the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, when the rules don't make sense or when the rules are harmful, it's like, at least for me, my brain's like, well, what do we do with this? Like,
Yeah.
how do we break the rules? The rules are not good, but, and that's definitely something that I have worked on and continue to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's my podcast. I can swear. It's such a mind fuck. Like it's because you're trying to not sin. You're trying to be respectful. Like there's so much that's built into the system that insulates the system from any repercussions.
Mm-hmm.
And so individuals end up bearing the brunt of that. And it's so confusing to try and make sense of it when I'm working for a Christian institution and we're the good guys. And like when you start to pull on that thread and be like, oh, they're doing this because they need money or they're doing this for whatever. And like HR isn't your friend in general, but I would say
Mm-hmm.
definitely in Christian institutions, it's there to protect the institution, whether that's a school or a ministry or just the church in general. Public image and PR and how are we bringing in more people? I grew up evangelical, so how are we spreading the word was like
Mm-hmm.
much more important than this one individual has been harmed. And so it's very hard to kind of start to even like say, oh, boundaries have been crossed because you don't have a framework for what healthy boundaries are.
Right. What are boundaries?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so that's really tough. And then making sense of it and learning like how to get some of that out of your body when you've been raised in it because it's
Mm-hmm.
in there. There's deconstruction, the intellectual process, and then there's what I refer to as kind of deconversion, which is like getting it out of your system. Like
Yeah.
purity culture is the thing that stays in. If you're raised with some toxic theology, like original sin, that's something that stays in you. So like these ideas of worth and value, it's hard to set good boundaries when you don't feel like you deserve them. And so
Yes.
like a lot of that stuff is, it's not just, oh, I got a new job or I'm not that version of religious anymore, but it's, oh, now I got to get this out of my system.
Mm-hmm. And this was true for me, and I find this is true for a lot of the folks that I work with, some version of feeling like you're a floating head, like you're not connected to your body at all
Mhm.
when you're coming out of all of that, and you're like deconstructing, possibly deconverting, like figuring that all out. It's like, okay, this is all happening up here, but don't even have any awareness that there is a body attached to my
Right.
brain.
Yeah.
You know, and so figuring out, okay, well, how do I remake this connection?
Yeah. Because your body is potentially misleading. It's sinful.
Hmm.
And so you are taught to turn it off to some degree.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that overlaps with another thing that I work with. I work a lot with body image concerns.
Mhm.
I find there's a lot of overlap for folks of messages that they may have gotten from purity culture about,
Mhm.
being shameful around their body, what their body is allowed and not allowed to do, like experiences around pleasure. And that also comes up with messages from diet culture of
Yeah.
what part of your body is okay, what kinds of bodies are okay, pleasure with food and experiences in your body,
Mhm.
you know. And so there's a lot of work there with reconnecting brain and body, and like existing in this
Yeah.
physical being that we have.
Yeah. And I think religion amplifies a lot of that, but I think that's true in our culture too.
Hmm.
That there are systems in place that promote patriarchy, and so beauty from a male gaze specifically, and the kind of the standards we have around good looks and what that means, and some of the implicit biases that go along with that, like that stuff we pick up before we're cognitively aware that we're
Hmm.
learning it, and then to like unlearn it and learn a healthier version of it is you have to be aware of it, and then there's work to do once you become
Yes.
aware of it.
Yeah, and it's hard work, and it can feel so unfair because you are swimming in those waters before you're even able to say, yes, I'm okay with accepting these beliefs, that they're just all
Mhm.
around you.
Yeah.
Um, and to realize, like, wow, okay, now I have to do a lot of work to undo the things that I was given that
Mhm.
I didn't consent to being given,
Yeah.
both with religion and with body stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And that uh I've I've always owned this as a me thing, but it might be a cultural thing. I like intellectualizing that goes on. Like there's one part to know it in your head, and then there's another separate issue to connect your brain to your body,
Hmm.
because for whatever reason we pretend like mental health is different than physical health, even though your brain is an organ as much as your kidneys are, and like it's going to operate as such. So connecting your brain to your body is important. That's what wants to happen, and we are taught all these ways to disconnect from our body.
Yes, yeah. And so then we have to relearn how to reconnect because we
Yeah,
lost that intuition, lost that ability.
right. Was that a thing that you picked up as you got into the mental health field? Was that what you wanted to work on with when you were going back to your master's? Because I know religious trauma was the niche that found you. Was body image stuff, was that something that you're like, this is what I want to work with, or was that another, I don't want to say client dictated, but like seeing clients and seeing that there was a need there?
That was something that kind of came from my time in graduate school. I
Hmm.
had a professor that did a lot of work around body image stuff, and especially doing it from a weight inclusive perspective.
Hmm.
Um, and that was something new to me. And so I kind of picked that up um, along the way there. When I first went into graduate school, I thought that I was probably going to concentrate on anxiety,
Hmm.
maybe some depression. I think because those are so prevalent, and I have personal experiences with anxiety,
Sure.
and that felt like something that a lot of people need this, and I can be helpful here. And then, you know, like I said, my professor's interest and work around weight inclusive care kind of drew me in that direction, and then
Yeah.
everything came together to also draw draw me toward religious trauma. And then as I was working with folks, I realized how much overlap there can be. Now, that's not true for all of my clients. I have some clients that are coming for religious trauma, or some that are coming for body image, and there's not overlap. But for a big chunk of the folks I work with, there is overlap there.
Yeah.
And so helping make those connections and helping them no longer be a floating head, to be a head connected to a body.
Yeah, and just kind of, I'm processing in real time here that Venn diagram of religious trauma and body image. I mean, you have issues of identity, you have issues of self-worth, you have issues of self-care. So like there's so much that it makes so much sense that there's a lot of overlap there. I see it a lot with the religious trauma community that I work with, like that identity issue of like rebuilding that, and like understanding your ethics haven't changed that much. Your values and your morals likely haven't changed all that much. In some cases, it's the church that's changed. And getting to that point of like, okay, well, like, what does that feel like in my body now? And there's a lot of understanding and creating safety so that you can feel your body, and then learn kind of to be comfortable in your own skin, as opposed to there's a right and a wrong way to do this.
Yes. And normalizing that if you have been existing pretty much in your head for years or even decades, like there's probably going to be some discomfort in trying to connect with your body. And it's okay if we do it in small pieces. Like there's no expectation that, it's like a snap of the fingers and okay, everything is reconnected and feels good.
Yeah.
Like that's not realistic.
Right. Yeah. And I would say just culture in general is uncomfortable with it. The example I use all the time is funerals. You go to a funeral on Friday and you're back to work on Monday. And like, that's such a weird expectation to hold.
Yes.
That big emotions like grief and loss you can get through in 3 days. Like that's insane to me. And so things like restructuring your identity or reevaluating and rebuilding a belief system, like there's a whole process to that. It is not 1 or 2 therapy sessions.
And there's a whole lot of grief and loss to that too that is not recognized. Like there's so often with folks that like when you name that it sounds like you're grieving, that hasn't even crossed their mind. And like, am I allowed to grieve this? Especially if they feel like they chose to leave. Am I allowed to grieve something that I chose to walk away from?
Right.
And so being able to allow space for grief, especially when we're in a culture that doesn't really grieve well at all.
No.
Anything doesn't allow space for grieving.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of like permission giving coming out of religious trauma, because again, there's that deference to an authority figure, and learning that that was always arbitrary, and getting comfortable with like not needing that external approval, what that feels like to give it to yourself and say, I'm allowed to feel this way, is a new experience for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm maybe this is a bugaboo of mine. What was your experience in grad school around business practices as you own your own practice and run your own stuff? Did you have education around that? Was that a figure it out on the fly kind of thing? Was that a switch because of COVID? Kind of walk us through the business side of your working in the mental health field.
I did not have any business training in grad school. I really do wish that was at least part of the program or an option, maybe to do some joint classes, especially if you're at a school that has a business program. But no training there. When I came out of grad school, I worked in community mental health for a couple years. That was a very hard experience, as many therapists know. You are faced with a wide variety of clients. A lot of the therapists who work in community mental health are fresh out of grad school. And there's a lot of learning on the fly. And you also are very often overworked and underpaid.
Yeah.
So looking back, I can say that was a helpful experience. At the time, it was a very hard experience.
Mhm.
So it took me about 2 years in North Carolina, we have associate licensure, which it takes about 2 years to get all of your license under supervision of
Sure.
another
Yeah.
therapist. Okay.
Yep.
I know different states do that differently.
Yeah, the
Um,
language is different, but the system is the same here.
okay. And so after 2 years, I was independently licensed. And so I decided to join a group practice and have more of a private practice feel, but I still had some structure with me.
Sure. Yeah.
And then 2020 happened. I
Yeah.
was still with the group practice, but we went to all telehealth,
Mhm.
which I never thought I would do.
Yeah.
I was like, I want to always be in an office. I can't imagine doing telehealth. But COVID forced a lot of us to do that.
Yeah.
And by the end of 2020, I was like, I think I really want to do this solo. I was getting more into realizing like this is really like religious trauma is a niche that I really want to work with.
Mhm.
I want to specialize a little more, have a little bit more control over my practice. And so I would say 2020 was part of a catalyst. But so I did like basically any podcast or online training that was about how to be a therapist in private
Yeah.
practice, the business side, like just gleaning everything, all the information that I possibly could, and then taking the step to
Yep.
get started. And I am a telehealth only practice. I find that's helpful because I can serve the whole state of North Carolina.
Mhm.
And I have a lot of clients that actually really like that. Because it's hard to find a religious trauma therapist.
Right.
So I don't have to be near them for that. But also, especially at the beginning, there can be some fear of like, well, if I talk about my specific church, are you going to know people there?
Yeah.
Um, and if, I'm in central North Carolina. So if somebody's in the mountains, they might feel a little more comfortable of talking about a specific church or a specific group in their area without
Yeah.
worrying about what my connections to them might be.
Yeah. And for people who maybe didn't grow up super religious, these communities are very small, but oddly interconnected. And
Mm-hmm.
so, even though you might not be at the same church, so and so who married so and so's kid, who's this person's pastor, and like
Yep.
those degrees of separation, it doesn't take much before you know the same circles, and so that's a legitimate fear for a lot of people, especially if it's a really high control church group where it's risky to talk to somebody outside of the group.
Mm-hmm. And
Mm.
especially when you're first kind of treading into the possibility of therapy and you
Yeah.
don't really know the therapist yet, like, to me, that is a person listening to their intuition of like, I need to make sure that this person is safe.
Yeah.
And one way I can do that is geographical distance.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and similar in Wisconsin. I mean, it's the Midwest tends to be quite conservative, um, perhaps for different reasons. It's the Bible Belt, but like similar, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
conservative, and geography plays a big role. I'm the only religious trauma therapist in Wisconsin right now, and so like it is one of those things where I'm in Southeast Wisconsin on the lake. If you're in the North Woods, you need someone who is not in your church community, and you've probably done pastoral counseling. Let's put that in quotes,
Right.
and highlight that that's not real therapy. And so you've done some of these things, and that experience with somebody outside of the church and that experience away from the religious setting might be very freeing, but frightening to get started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so true. And I think that's a great point that you make, that for a lot of folks, their first foray into what they might think is counseling is that pastoral counseling or biblical counseling, which
Yeah.
generally is someone that may have like a few hours of
Right.
training and here's some
A
Bible
class.
verses. Yeah, like that is not therapy.
Right.
Um, and that can really sometimes add to the harm
Yeah.
of, what they have experienced. And then, well, if that's what counseling is like, I'm not going to do that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And good little Christian Jeremy, when he started out, how many hours I spent as a marriage therapist breaking down verses in Ephesians about wives submitting to their husbands.
Mm,
And I was a liberal Christian at that point, but like still it's just one of those things where even if you're seeing therapists, if you're used to seeing it from a religious perspective, it's a different vibe, it's a different feel than you're going to get from someone who's practicing from a secular or a religious trauma perspective.
mm-hmm. Yeah. That's one thing. I am so thankful for the therapist that I was seeing as when I was going through the early days of my journey. Because, like I said, she did not specialize in religious trauma. I don't really know of anybody that was talking about religious trauma at that
Yeah.
point in time. And she was a Christian, but she was so wise in if and how she incorporated that, like
Yeah.
very client led from that. If you wanted that to be part of your work, because when we first started working together, I did, like, that's where I
Yeah.
was. I wanted
Right.
that to be part of it. And over time it transitioned to like, yeah, I don't want this anymore. Like, this is not welcome. And she was able to make that transition
Yeah.
with me.
That's
And I
really
think,
lovely.
yeah, I think that's a big difference between someone who is trained as a therapist versus someone who does not have that training.
Right. Yeah. Because, well, I'm biased because I grew up fundamentalist, but knowing the pastors in my family or that I experienced in my growing up years, like they truly believe that they're doing good
Mm-hmm.
by telling someone this is sinful or this is wrong or you need to pray harder or believe harder or whatever. And for someone who's struggling with that or asking very valid questions, that feedback's really harmful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear so many horror stories, so it is wonderful to hear of a therapist who adapted to their client in a healthy and supportive way. Like,
Yeah.
yay, therapy when it goes the way it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'll often look back on that and I'm like, I am so thankful that she was able to kind of follow where I was going.
Mhm.
Because I don't think I could have handled more harm at that point in time.
Yeah,
So that experience was very healing after I
yeah,
had been really just destroyed.
right. Yeah, yeah. And if you aren't having that experience in therapy, find a new therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Michelle, I'm gonna pivot a little bit here. What is modern day? What does current self-care look like? Where are you cultivating joy in your life? What does your life kind of entail when you're not with clients?
I think a big thing for me right now is becoming more aware of how my brain works and like what capacity that I have for things. I think it was really driven into me, that whole idea of like suffering for Christ, and you give
Mm,
and you give and you give. And that's been something that's hard to let go of and
sure.
hard to really tune into my own needs and the fact that we all have different capacities, and sometimes mine looks less than what I would want it to be. So that has been a big journey of self-care for me, of just recognizing like, no, like I need to rest right now. I
Mhm.
cannot do this, or I will not commit to another thing. And that is okay.
Yeah,
Um, so that's been a big part of my journey over the probably past couple years.
yeah, yeah. And there is that like find a way to serve or use your time, talents, or treasure. That was the big
Mm-hmm.
phrase in my growing up. Um, this expectation that there's always more you could be doing, and there's not a lot of time to rest. If you're worried about the rapture or, your time is limited here, like you always have a lot of pressure to be going, going, going. And then capitalistic society on top of that, that productive success mindset is really hard to kind of learn to slow down
Yes.
and
Yeah.
be okay with that.
And I think especially in private practice, like we get paid when we see clients. And so there can be that pressure of, well, I'll take on more clients because that'll be more financial security.
Yep.
And, being aware of, okay, but there's a certain number of clients that I can see and serve them well. And beyond that, like, I'm doing a disservice to everybody.
Right. Yeah. Which is the thing that we all tell our clients. We know this. We know this to be true, and applying it to ourselves is still difficult. It's easy to check
Mm-hmm.
that box intellectually, but to live that experience is a little bit more work.
Mm-hmm. It is. It is. It's
Yeah.
definitely work to do the things that we're always talking with clients about. It's like it's reminders of, oh yeah, I need to do that too.
Yeah. Yeah. I have, I work with a number of other mental health professionals or a lot of medical people in the medical profession too. And we have a lot of these conversations of like, I know you know this, but are you doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, Jeremy, no one's doing it. Like, well, that's not true. It's work, but some of us are doing it. And COVID, I think even we're still just seeing a lot of the fallout of that. Just moving everything virtual was a lot of work for therapists
Mm-hmm.
if we weren't aware of that or set up for that. A lot of infrastructure didn't exist that needed to happen. And like it was just you just did it because your clients needed it. And what a huge energy investment that was.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and private practice is so wonderful and freeing and really good, but it's so easy for those, oh, I can fit one more people in, I can fit one more person in, or I
Mm-hmm.
can adjust my schedule because this client needs it, or I'm not going to take an extra day of vacation because I want to make a little bit more. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's freedom when you run your own practice, but it's also a test of good boundaries when you run your own practice to commit to that freedom being used for healthy reasons.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I know very little about North Carolina. I guess I know there are mountains and there's coast. What's Central Carolina like? Is it?
Um, well, that is where the triangle is, which is Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. So
Yeah.
some folks are, familiar, like major airport in Raleigh, Duke University, NC State, UNC Chapel Hill, all right there.
Hmm.
Um, so there is definitely like a college vibe. A lot of research goes on in this area.
Sure.
But then there's also a lot of rural um, areas, farms, and that kind of thing
Yeah.
in central North Carolina. So,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people appreciate that depending on where you are in central North Carolina, it's, 2 to 4 hours to the beach, 2 to 4 hours to the mountains.
Sure.
So
Yeah. That's really nice. My guilty pleasure, not guilty pleasure, uh, my TV that isn't popular amongst people that I admit to liking is pro wrestling, and so I know a lot of Raleigh, North Carolina references to the pro wrestling industry. The North
okay.
Carolina territories were like a really big deal. Ric Flair's from North Carolina, so I know that. And religious trauma. Bart Ehrman's at UNC Chapel
Yes.
Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Is a lot of people's dipping their toes into deconstruction is one of
Mm-hmm.
Bart Ehrman's books.
Yep.
Um, yeah. So like, man, what a interesting time and space to practice in because I think
Yeah.
like North Carolina, I think of Bart Ehrman and then I also think of like Southern Baptist Church. Like those are
Yeah.
a fun dichotomy.
I mean, a lot of North Carolina is that kind of dichotomy. Like you have very conservative, um, don't want any change, uh, folks that have been here forever, um, always gonna vote Republican because that's what we do. And
Yeah.
then you also have pockets of very liberal, um, looking for change, looking for education, willing to embrace new ideas and new ways of thinking.
Hmm.
Like a few big pockets of that I think of are like the Chapel Hill area with UNC
Right.
Chapel Hill, the Greensboro area and UNC Greensboro, which is
Hmm.
where I went to grad school, like the Asheville area, these areas where there very much is a thirst for learning and growing and changing where needed,
Yeah.
mixed in with these pockets of nope, things are good. Like they're serving me well. Let's keep them this way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's going on everywhere. I mean, college towns are unique for those people who maybe haven't experienced one. I went to University of Minnesota, which is in the middle, the heart of the Twin Cities, and campus is different than the city, and the city is very different than rural Minnesota. So it's, yeah, all these kind of different layers to it. Super fascinating. Michelle, if people want to learn more about you, if they want to work with you, if they want to find your stuff, where do they go?
So my website has everything on it. It has info about me, my offerings, including that continuing education. And it is my name. It's michellefmoseley.com. So MICHELLEFMOSELEY.com. Excuse me. And then I'm also pretty active on Instagram, and my handle there is at therapy_with_Michelle. So those are probably the two best places.
Yeah, and we'll have that stuff in the show notes, so it's linked to that, and it's easy for people.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I love, we'll highlight those continuing eds, because I know for the professionals who are listening, like stuff like that, when it counts for continuing education, people want to take it. That's great to learn. Also great to meet your licensure requirements.
Right. It's a twofer.
Yes, for sure. Well, Michelle, this has been a delight. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you so much for offering the opportunity. I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Yeah, awesome. And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.